The night Seraphine Vale realized her husband had never loved her wasn't the night he took a mistress. It wasn't the night he stopped coming to their bed, or the night she heard Evelyn's laughter echoing through the east wing like the woman already owned the stones. It was tonight, blood moon ceremony, the entire Silverfang court watching, when Darius looked straight at his queen and smiled at someone standing behind her. That smile. She'd waited years to earn it. She never did. If you're watching this from your city right now, drop it in the comments, because what Seraphine does next is going to hit different, depending on where you're sitting. Stay with her. Every second of this matters. Mastam. The hall had been built to make rulers feel eternal. That was the point of the bone-white columns, the torchlight that never quite reached the upper vaults, the flagstone floor worn smooth by 300 years of boots and blood and ceremony. The Silverfang throne room didn't ask you to feel small. It simply made smallness inevitable. The architecture itself a statement about who mattered and who existed only to witness those who did. Seraphine had walked this floor 1,000 times. She knew the way the cold came up through the stone in winter, bleeding through thin-soled court shoes and settling in the ankles by the third hour of standing. She knew which columns had stress fractures along the base, which wall tapestries hid the draft from the northern corridors, which patches of floor would carry sound if you needed to hear a whispered conversation 30 feet away. She had studied this room the way a soldier studies a battlefield, because that's what it was. She stood at the edge of the preparation antechamber, alone save for her attendant Mira, who was working the last clasp on the ceremonial robe with fingers that had gone slightly unsteady. The robe was silver white, embroidered at the collar and cuffs in the old lunar script, a gift from her mother, made for the day Seraphine had ascended as Luna. The embroidery was the only thing about tonight that felt like it belonged to her. "You're going to pull a thread if you keep twisting it like that," Seraphine said. Mira's hands stilled. "Forgive me, my lady." "Don't apologize, just breathe." Mira breathed. Seraphine did not. Through the heavy door, the low register of the court's assembled voices came through as a kind of pressure rather than sound. 200 wolves of rank, the generals of the 3 northern packs, the council's elder representatives, and every ambassador who had traveled to observe the blood moon rites. All of them already seated. All of them already waiting. The ceremony was the oldest continuous ritual in the Silverfang calendar. Older than the throne, older than the Thorn bloodline itself. Once per year, under the full blood moon, the Alpha King and his bonded Luna stood together before the court to renew what the old text called the Covenant of the Flame, a formal acknowledgement that the kingdom's power ran through both of them, that neither could stand alone without fracturing the compact that held the alliance pacts in loyalty. It was tradition. It was theater. It was the one night of the year when Seraphine's presence at Darius's side was not merely permitted, but structurally required. She had been preparing for it for 3 weeks. She had drafted the ceremonial words twice. She had reviewed the alliance records with Councillor Fenwick, had confirmed attendance with each pack representative, had overseen the seating arrangements in the hall with the precision she brought to everything she touched in this palace. The quiet, thorough, invisible precision that kept Darius's kingdom from dissolving into the factional chaos it would have become inside a year without her. None of that work had his name on it. It never did. "My lady," Mira's voice came carefully, "they'll open the doors in a few minutes. I know. The king sent word an hour ago that I know what the king sent word about." Silence. Seraphine looked at herself in the standing mirror beside the door. She had never been the kind of woman the court called beautiful in the way they called Evelyn beautiful, which was to say, obviously, loudly. Evelyn wore herself like a weapon drawn and held at throat level, all dark eyes and deliberate mouth, and the particular quality of stillness that made men's attention snap to her the way metal snapped toward a lodestone. Men noticed Evelyn before they'd finished crossing a room. They noticed Seraphine afterward, if they bothered, and then they usually found her unremarkable. Steady gray eyes, brown hair with no dramatic flair, a face that didn't announce anything. Competent, they said. Composed. What Darius had called her once, early in their mating, when she'd thought it was a compliment. Reliable. She touched the bond mark at the side of her neck, low on the throat just above the collarbone, where the skin was slightly raised in the shape that the old families still recognized. the double crescent, the mark of a true bond between Alpha and Luna. It had burned the night it formed, a deep, specific pain, like something old and necessary being written into the body. It burned now too, a different kind of pain, a warning kind. Mira, my lady? When the ceremony is done, whatever happens, you leave through the servants' corridor on the east side. You don't wait for me. You don't try to reach me. You go straight to your family quarters and you lock the door. Mira went very still. My lady, I need you to say you understand. A long pause. Then quietly, I understand. Seraphine pulled her hands away from the bond mark. She straightened the robe's collar with two flat-palmed presses. She looked at the door. The doors opened. Dumum. The court's collective attention was a physical sensation, the kind that started at the back of the skull and moved forward, like pressure change before a storm. 200 pairs of eyes following her passage from the antechamber doors to the ceremonial dais at the hall's center, the path marked by torches set in iron brackets along the floor. She walked it the way she'd walked it every year for 7 years, measured, straight, eyes forward. The dais held 2 chairs, not thrones, which would have been improper for a ceremony of renewal rather than coronation, but the high-backed ceremonial seats in dark oak that were brought out only for the blood moon. On the left, Darius's. On the right, hers. Darius was already there. He stood at the front of the dais in full alpha ceremonial dress, the dark wool coat with the thorn sigil at the chest, the rank collar in hammered silver, the kind of clothes that had been designed 3 generations ago to make whoever wore them look like the answer to something. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired and held himself with the particular gravity of a man who had never in his adult life entered a room without owning it. He wasn't looking at Seraphine. He was looking at the seat to his left. Not his seat. To his left. The chair that had been placed, she saw it now. She had not seen it in the arrangement drawings. It had not been in the arrangement drawings, slightly closer to Darius's chair than her own was. A different chair. Not the ceremonial oak. Something newer, cushioned in deep red. Evelyn was sitting in it. And Lady Evelyn Crane wore a gown the color of arterial blood, and she wore it the way she wore everything, with the complete ease of someone who expected the room to arrange itself around her. Her dark hair was pinned with silver combs. Her neck was bare. She held Darius's attention with the specific quality of a woman who had learned exactly what angle of her head produced a certain response from him, and she used it now, smiling up at him, while the court watched with the terrible patience of people who had already been told what was coming. Seraphine stopped walking, not dramatically, not with visible trembling or sudden whitening of the face. She simply stopped, 4 feet from the edge of the dais, at the exact place where the torchlight shifted from orange to silver. And she looked at the arrangement before her, and she understood it completely. The understanding arrived all at once, like cold water. He had given Evelyn her chair, not a chair beside his, not a position at the side of the dais, acceptable and uncomfortable. Her chair, the Luna's chair, moved, adjusted, placed on his left as though it had always been there, and Seraphine's own chair, she saw now, had been set back and to the side. The position of a witness, the position of a woman who was present to observe a ceremony in which she had no function. Luna Seraphine. Darius spoke her title with no warmth and no acknowledgement of what he'd done. His voice carried easily in the hall, trained for it, used to it, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to fill a room. Come forward. She did not move. 1 breath. 2. Come forward, he said again. I can hear you from here, Seraphine said. She heard the court's small collective intake, not loud, just the way 200 people adjusted their breathing simultaneously. At the back of the hall, someone coughed and didn't finish. Darius's jaw shifted. He descended the dais steps with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of communication, each step saying something about patience being extended, about authority being visibly restrained. He stopped 3 feet from her, and his voice dropped below carrying range, intended for her alone. This isn't the time, he said. For what? For whatever this is. The stalling, the performance. I stopped walking, Seraphine said. That's all I've done. You know what tonight is. I know exactly what tonight is. Darius held her gaze for a moment. His eyes were the flat dark of old flint. Not unkind, because unkindness required feeling something, just empty of anything she'd been looking for in them for a long time. "Evelyn sits with me tonight," he said. "The court already knows. The announcement will follow the rites. You'll be given an appropriate— What was the word you were going to use?" He stopped. "Appropriate?" she repeated. "Appropriate position, appropriate title, something appropriate." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I haven't made a single thing tonight," Seraphine said. "I arrived. You made the rest." His expression moved. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, the particular compression of a man unused to being spoken to in a room full of people who were absolutely listening. "I need you to go to your chair," he said. "Sit down. Let the ceremony proceed." "My chair isn't there anymore." "There's a chair for you." "There's a chair," she said. "That isn't mine." Darius let the silence run for 3 seconds, then, "You're embarrassing yourself." And there it was, 7 years of it, and it still had a specific temperature when it landed. Not hot, not cold, but the particular sensation of something being placed precisely on the exact bruise it had made before. She heard it, and she felt it, and she did not flinch. "All right," he said, "we'll do it this way." He turned back toward the dais and raised his voice to address the court. "Our Luna has chosen to stand at the floor tonight rather than join the dais." The shift was immediate. Small sounds, small movements, the particular rustling of 200 people deciding what their faces should be doing. "The ceremony will proceed." He mounted the dais steps and stood at his chair, looking down at Seraphine with the tired patience of a man managing a minor inconvenience. "Begin." The court's ceremonial herald, a gray-haired man named Aldrich, who had served through 2 Alpha Kings, and who had, Seraphine happened to know, opposed this arrangement in private council and been overruled, unrolled the right scroll with slightly more trembling in his hands than his position allowed for, and began to read. Seraphine stood at the floor. She did not look at Evelyn, who had settled into the Luna's chair with the careful arrangement of a woman managing her satisfaction. She did not look at the council's row, where Fenwick sat with his eyes aimed at a point approximately 4 feet in front of his own feet. She did not look at the generals, or the visiting pack representatives, or the ambassador from the Eastern Territories who was leaning toward his aide and speaking quietly behind a covering hand. She looked at Darius. She had always been very good at looking at things as they actually were. It was the skill she'd come into the marriage with, the thing her mother had pushed into her from childhood. See it clearly, all of it, not just what you want to be there. She had spent 7 years applying this skill to Darius Thorne, and what it had given her was a precise and unsentimental inventory of who he was. A powerful man who had learned to weaponize neglect, who had found that cruelty delivered quietly, with plausible deniability, left less evidence than cruelty delivered loudly. He had never hit her. He had never needed to. There were other ways to make someone feel like they were dissolving. The herald read the opening ceremonial words in the old tongue, and the torches guttered slightly in a draft from the doors, and Seraphine felt the bond mark burning at her throat with a pain that had been building for 3 weeks and was now, standing in this hall with 200 witnesses, working its way toward something she didn't have a word for yet. "The covenant of the flame is renewed by the willing union of Alpha and Luna," Aldrich read. His voice strained only slightly on the word willing. "By the bond between them, which is recognized and witnessed, I want her to kneel." Darius said it conversationally, not loudly, not with particular heat. The same way he might have mentioned a scheduling change or a menu preference. His eyes were on Seraphine. The herald stopped reading. "Sire," Aldrich began. "As acknowledgement of the new order," Darius said, still looking at Seraphine, "before the rites continue. She kneels before Evelyn, as a formal relinquishment." The silence in the hall was a particular kind of silence, the kind produced by people who have just heard something they cannot yet process and are still waiting to discover if they heard it correctly. Seraphine looked at him, then at Evelyn, who was looking back with an expression so carefully neutral it had to be deliberate. The expression of someone who has prepared for this moment and practiced the face they want to be wearing when it arrives. Then back at Darius. "No," Seraphine said. "That wasn't a request." "I know it wasn't." She held his gaze. "No." Darius's patience, The careful, managed, tactical patience of a man who understood that force applied visibly in a room full of witnesses created problems. Slipped. Just at the edges. Just enough to be visible to anyone paying close attention, and everyone in the hall was paying very close attention. "You're standing in my throne room," he said, and now the voice had dropped the conversational register and picked up something with more weight to it. "In front of my court, at my ceremony, and you're refusing a direct order." "I'm refusing a specific order," Seraphine said. "The order to kneel before your mistress." "Yes, I'm refusing that." "You don't have that choice." "I seem to." He came down the dais steps. He didn't move fast. An alpha at full speed was not something that happened when there was a point to be made. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of absolute certainty, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could smell the ceremonial oil on his coat and the anger underneath it, the particular scent of a dominant wolf whose authority was being challenged in front of its pack. "Kneel," he said, very quietly, "or I will remove your title tonight instead of tomorrow." Around them, the hall had become very still. Not quiet. Stillness and quiet were different things. The stillness was the kind that preceded something that couldn't be unseen. Seraphine looked up at him. She was not a small woman, but Darius Thorne was built on a different scale, and this closed the difference registered in the body. The fundamental animal calculus of size and dominance that ran beneath rational thought in every wolf's blood, the deep instinct that said pack hierarchy was physical and real and could be felt like pressure. She had spent 7 years learning to feel that pressure and stand anyway. She looked at him and she felt the bond mark burning like something was being unmade inside it, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her. "I am not afraid of you." She had been afraid of him. There were years when she had been very afraid. What she felt now was something else, something that lived on the other side of fear, in the country you reach when you have nothing left to lose except yourself, and you discover that yourself is the thing you were protecting all along. "No," she said. He raised his hand. Not to strike her. She didn't think even Darius, in this hall, with these witnesses, would go that far. But the gesture was enough. The reaching for her arm, the intention to force compliance physically, the decision to make the body do what the voice could not. She caught his wrist, with her left hand. Bare. The motion was fast and clean and completely without hesitation, the kind of movement that came not from training, but from 7 years of watching this man and understanding, at a level below deliberate thought, exactly how he moved. His wrist in her grip. His face, for 1 full second, showing something she had never seen on it before. Surprise. "Don't," she said. The hall was absolutely still. Darius looked down at her hand on his wrist with an expression that moved through several registers rapidly. Surprise, recalibration, and finally the cold, hard set of a man who has been publicly defied and is now calculating his options with the dispassion of a general adjusting a battle plan. He pulled his wrist back slowly. She released it. "Get her out," he said. 2 guards, large, armored, the palace household units who understood their function was not personal loyalty but structural authority, moved from their positions at the hall's perimeter. "Remove her to the outer vestibule," Darius said. "She's suspended from the dais pending review of her—" "The records are in the archive," Seraphine said. She wasn't speaking to Darius. She raised her voice, not to a shout, just to carrying level, just to the volume that reached the back rows of the assembled court, the generals, the council, the visiting representatives. "The Eastern Archive," she said. "3rd floor, restricted section, Cabinet 16. The correspondence between the Crown and Lady Evelyn's family going back 4 years. The dates on the earliest letters." She paused. "The date of my miscarriage is also in the medical record. In Cabinet 9, same floor." The guards had stopped. Darius had gone very still. "I would suggest," Seraphine said with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "that anyone in this hall who cares about the actual legitimacy of this kingdom go and look at those records before they decide whose side they're on." The silence that followed was different from the silences before. This one had texture to it, weight, the kind of quiet that forms when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid, when a door has been opened that cannot be closed, and everyone in the room is processing the new shape of the world. Darius turned to face her fully. The mask was gone. Not the controlled anger, not the tactical patience. What was underneath it was something rawer and more dangerous. The look of a man confronting something he has spent years making sure would never come into the light. "Take her," he said. The guards moved. Seraphine let them. She let them take her arms, one on each side, because she had said what she came to say, and because the time for this particular kind of fight was not now. Not yet. Now the words were out in the hall and living in the ears of everyone who'd heard them, and what happened next depended on what those people decided to do with what they'd heard. She didn't struggle. She didn't speak again. She walked. At the hall's main doors, one of the guards, young, one she didn't know by name but whose face she recognized from morning gate rotation, looked at her sideways and almost imperceptibly eased the grip on her arm. Just slightly. Just enough to say something he couldn't say out loud. She noted it, filed it. The doors closed behind her. Gimbamt. The outer vestibule was cold and lit by 2 torches and contained a bench she'd never had reason to sit on. She sat on it now. Her hands, in her lap, were completely steady, which she found faintly remarkable. She had just done what she'd done, in front of every relevant person in the kingdom, and her hands were steady. The bond mark burned. It had been burning since she'd walked into the hall, but now it was something different. Not the warning burn, not the pain of a strained bond. This was something almost like heat, like the mark understood something was coming. She had 3 months of work in the restricted archive. Mira had helped her in the early stages. Fenwick, careful, terrified Fenwick, who had handed her the key to Cabinet 16 3 weeks ago and then spent a week pretending he'd never seen her in the corridor, had given her access he was never supposed to give. The 2 warriors from the Northern Patrol, Garrett and Solon, who had come to her 6 months ago with what they'd seen on the eastern border, had provided the testimonies she'd spent 2 weeks cross-referencing against the correspondence. The picture was complete, had been complete for weeks. She had been waiting for the right moment to open the door. Darius had chosen the moment for her. She listened to the hall's sounds through the closed doors. A murmur that wasn't quite resolved, the particular acoustic signature of a large room full of people in rapid private consultation. She had spent 7 years learning the sounds of this palace, and what she heard through those doors was not the sound of a ceremony proceeding. It was the sound of something breaking. She sat very still on the cold bench and felt the bond mark burning and thought about the things she had inherited from her mother and kept secret for 7 years. The ability she had used exactly twice in her life, both times in controlled conditions alone in the northern wing, both times accompanied by a pain that had left her unconscious for 6 hours. Her mother had warned her about it, had warned her the way you warn someone about a tool that will work perfectly once and then exact a cost you can't fully predict. You only do this when there's nothing left worth preserving, her mother had said, when the bond itself is the wound. She looked at her hands. Through the door, she heard raised voices, then a specific voice. Counselor Fenwick, whom she would not have predicted had it in him, speaking at full carrying volume, saying the word archive. Seraphine closed her eyes. She felt the bond mark burning, and she felt the thing underneath it. The ancient, specific power that had lived in her bloodline since before the Silverfang Kingdom had a name. The power her mother had called a last resort and a mercy and a truth that the body had to accept before the mind would. She opened her eyes. The vestibule door opened. Not the main hall doors, the side passage, the servants' corridor, and standing in it was not a guard, not Mira. It was Garrett, one of the Northern Patrol warriors, still in travel-dusty riding clothes, breathing like he'd come fast from somewhere and hadn't stopped. His face, when he saw her, cycled through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds: relief, urgency, and something that was almost grief. "My lady," he said. He crossed the vestibule in 4 strides and crouched in front of the bench, so his voice didn't carry to the door. "I came straight from the Eastern Territories. Solon sent me. There's something you need to know." "I already know about the correspondence," Seraphine said. "I have copies of—" "Not the correspondence." His voice was tight. "Something else. About the midwife. The woman who attended your miscarriage." She went still. "We found her," Garrett said, 3 weeks ago. "In a village 2 territories east. She left the kingdom 3 years back, but she—" He stopped, jaw working. "She talked. My lady, she talked. And what she said about what happened that night—" The bond mark flared, hot, sudden, like a brand. Seraphine pressed her hand flat against it and held Garrett's eyes and said, very steadily, "Tell me." He told her, and in the cold vestibule, with the sounds of the fracturing ceremony coming through the walls and the torch flames bending in the draught from the passage door, something in Seraphine Vale that had been holding itself together for 7 years, holding together through neglect and dismissal and the slow, patient erosion of being made to feel like nothing, came apart at the roots, not breaking, not collapsing, becoming something else. By the time Garrett finished speaking, her face was dry. Her hands were still steady. Her eyes were clear with the particular clarity of a woman who has just had the last necessary piece handed to her and who understands exactly what she intends to do with it. "The midwife," she said. "Where is she now?" "Solon has her. Safe house, Northern Territory. She's willing to testify." "Who else knows?" "Just Solon and me and you." The bond mark burned like it was trying to warn her about something she had already decided. "Garrett," Seraphine said, "in 3 days, the Royal Council holds its monthly open session. All PAC representatives attend, the ambassadors." "Yes. I need you to get a message to Solon. He needs to bring her here by then." "My lady, if the king finds out—" "The king," Seraphine said, "has more to worry about tonight than what I'm planning." She stood. She smoothed the ceremonial robe, touched the bond mark once with 2 fingers. Not comfort, just acknowledgement, feeling it. "Go," she said. "I'll deal with tonight." Garrett went. The passage door closed. Seraphine turned back to the main hall doors. Through them, the voices were louder now. A specific kind of loud. The kind that happened when a room full of powerful people stopped pretending toward decorum and started saying things plainly. She heard her name. She heard archive. She heard Evelyn's name, spoken in a register that was not flattering. She heard Darius's voice raised in a way she had never heard it raised, with an edge in it that wasn't authority. Panic. She heard for the first time in 7 years Darius Thorne sound afraid. Her hand went to the door, and before she opened it, before she walked back into that hall and back into whatever the next hour would bring, which would not be a ceremony, which would not be orderly, which would be the thing she had spent 3 months building toward and which she now had everything she needed to finish, she stood for just one moment in the vestibule with her hand on the door. She thought of her mother's voice, of the northern mountains, of the thing burning in her blood that she had spent 7 years keeping quiet because she had not yet needed it the way her mother said she would know when she needed it. She thought of the word Garrett had used about the midwife. Willing. Her jaw tightened, her eyes closed, her eyes opened. She opened the door. The hall had changed in the minute she'd been gone. She felt it before she saw it. The quality of the air coming through the doors was different, charged in the specific way of a room where the balance of power had shifted and everyone inside was recalibrating in real time. When Seraphine pushed through the main doors and walked back onto the flagstone floor, what she saw confirmed it. The ceremony was dead, not adjourned, not paused. Dead. The herald scroll abandoned on the dais edge, the ceremonial torches still burning but nobody standing near them with any sense of their purpose. The assembled court had fractured into clusters. Generals with generals, council members with council members, the PAC representatives drawn together in a tight grouping near the east wall with the specific body language of men deciding whether the thing they'd just witnessed was an emergency or an opportunity. Darius stood at the center of it all, and he was not managing the room. He was barely managing himself. She could tell by the set of his shoulders, too high, too tight, the posture of a man whose authority had just been publicly questioned for the first time in memory, and whose body hadn't caught up to his face's performance of composure. 3 council members stood in front of him, and the one speaking was Councillor Marin, a woman of 60 who had survived 2 regime transitions and developed a very exact sense of when to ask dangerous questions. "The archive you mentioned," Marin was saying as Seraphine crossed the floor toward them. "Cabinet 16. Are those the Crane family letters, or—" "This conversation," Darius said, "is not happening tonight." "With respect, sire, the Luna made a public statement before the full court. The council has an obligation to recognize that my queen made a number of false and inflammatory—" "They're not false," Seraphine said. The cluster opened. Darius turned, and for a half second, just that, half a second, she saw in his face what she'd heard in his voice through the door, something that wasn't quite fear but lived in the same neighborhood. Then it was gone, sealed back under the controlled blankness, and what looked out at her again was the Alpha King calculating options. "You were removed from this hall," he said. I walked back in. She addressed Marin without breaking eye contact with Darius. "The Crane letters begin in the 3rd month of the year I was first with child. Cabinet 16, 3rd shelf, the ones with the Eastern Territorial seal." "You need to stop talking," Darius said. "The dates," Seraphine continued, "predate my miscarriage by 11 weeks. The letters discuss arrangements. The specific word used in the 4th letter is resolution." She finally looked at Marin. "The midwife who attended me that night has been located. She's in the Northern Territory. She'll testify before the council's open session." The silence that landed on that word, testify, had mass to it. Darius crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, not running, never running, but fast enough that the council members took a half step back. He stopped close enough that Seraphine could feel the contained force of him, the way rage in a dominant wolf wasn't just emotional, but physical. Something that radiated from the body and pressed against the air. "You've been planning this," he said, low, just for her. "I've been preparing," she said. "There's a difference." "How long?" "Long enough." His jaw worked. In the 7 years she'd spent watching him, she'd learned to read the specific tells that preceded his decisions. The jaw, the slight flare at the nostrils, the way his right hand would close when he was about to say something he'd already decided couldn't be walked back. His right hand closed. "The council will convene tomorrow morning," he said, raising his voice to the room, "to review the Luna's claims with appropriate process. Tonight's ceremony is suspended." He kept his eyes on Seraphine. "And my queen will return to her chambers under protective escort pending the investigation." Protective escort, the kind of language that meant something else entirely. "Councillor Marin," Seraphine said. "My lady, the council's open session is in 3 days. The pack representatives and ambassadors will be present. I would ask that the session not be moved or delayed." Marin looked at Darius, looked back at Seraphine. Something passed across her face that was old and careful and precisely measured. "The session is on the calendar," Marin said. "It stays on the calendar." Darius said nothing. That was, Seraphine understood, the first thing she'd won tonight. They gave her 4 guards. Not the household unit that handled normal palace security. She recognized 2 of the 4 as the king's personal detail, men whose loyalty ran to Darius specifically and not to the institution of the crown. The other 2 she didn't know. One of them was the young gate rotation guard who had eased his grip on her arm in the hall. She filed that information and said nothing. Her chambers were in the Queen's Wing, east side, 3rd floor, a suite she had spent 4 years making functional and had given up making comfortable around the 3rd year, when it became clear that comfort in this palace was a temporary condition that Darius could revoke without warning. The rooms were organized, clean. The desk held the work she'd been doing 3 nights ago, correspondence with the Northern Pack liaisons about supply routes that had nothing to do with any of this, but still needed to happen because someone in this kingdom had to think about supply routes. The guards posted themselves outside the door. She heard the bolt shift. Not her bolt, the outer bolt, the one on the corridor side. She stood in the center of the sitting room and listened to the bolt lock her in and thought, 3 days. Mira arrived at dawn through the servants' passage, the narrow one that connected the Queen's suite to the laundry corridor, the one that had a latch on the inside and which the guards apparently hadn't been briefed about. She brought bread and water and the expression of a woman who had been awake all night. "What happened after I left?" Seraphine asked, taking the bread. "Chaos." Mira sat on the footstool by the fireplace, pulling her shawl tight. The council pulled Councillor Aldrich aside before he'd gotten 10 feet from the dais. The Northern Pack representatives spent 2 hours in closed session, and Lord Crane, she stopped. Evelyn's father. He was shouting in the corridor outside the king's study until past midnight. I heard it from the laundry. What was he shouting about? His daughter's reputation mostly. A pause. And something about a promise. A specific promise that was apparently made and needed to be honored before things got further out of hand. Seraphine set down the bread. The king was with him? The king was behind a closed door. Whether he was listening is a separate question. Mira met her eyes. My lady, what do you need from me? She thought about what to say. Mira was not trained for this. She was an attendant, not a conspirator, and the line between what Seraphine was asking her to carry and what was safe to ask her to carry had been getting thin. Nothing dangerous, Seraphine said. I need you to deliver a message to Counselor Fenwick, in person, not written. What message? Tell him, the midwife is coming, he'll know what it means. Mira absorbed this, nodded once. And if someone asks where I've been, laundry. The morning passed in locked silence. She used it. She went through everything she'd committed to memory from the archive. Not the letters themselves, she hadn't been allowed to remove them, but she'd read them enough times that she could reconstruct the substance of each one with enough accuracy to testify to the content. The first letter established contact. The second discussed timing. The fourth, the one with resolution, was in a hand she recognized as Evelyn's own, not a secretary's, which mattered because it removed the argument that she hadn't known. The midwife's testimony would establish what the letters only implied. Together, they were enough. She'd been a student of this kingdom's legal framework long enough to know exactly what enough looked like. Around midday, she heard movement in the corridor, not the regular pacing of the guards, but additional footsteps, multiple people, stopping outside her door. Then Darius's voice. Give us the room. The sound of the guards repositioning, then the bolt. The door opened. He was alone. He had changed from the ceremonial clothes into riding dress, dark wool, no sigil collar, the kind of clothes that meant he'd been moving through the palace in a mode that didn't want to announce itself. He looked like he'd slept badly, or not at all, and the particular quality of the shadows under his eyes told her it was the latter. He closed the door behind him. You had help, he said. The archive access. Someone inside the council. I did my own research. You don't have archive clearance for Cabinet 16. No. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him processing the confirmation, she hadn't denied it, and running calculations about which council member had given her the key. She watched him land on Fenwick and then deliberately not say the name, because saying it would confirm she'd read him correctly, and confirming things was something Darius didn't do unless he controlled the terms. You're not going to make that session, he said. The council, he said, answers to me. Marin knows her limits. He moved further into the room, not toward her, just into the space, claiming it the way he claimed every space he entered. The midwife, whoever you think you found, there are questions of provenance, of competence. A woman who left the kingdom 3 years ago under circumstances that could be interpreted as, she left, Seraphine said, because she was afraid of what she'd been paid to do. The word paid landed. Darius's face stayed controlled. His right hand, hanging at his side, closed. You want to believe that, he said. I want to prove it. She held his eyes. Those are different things. I know the difference. He crossed to the window, looked out at the courtyard below, the training ground where, at this hour, the palace guard ran their morning forms. She could see his face in profile, and the thing she saw in it was not the tactical blankness and not the controlled anger. It was something she'd seen only a few times in 7 years, and usually in private. The face he wore when he was working something out that he hadn't solved yet. If you take this to open session, he said, in front of the representatives and the ambassadors, whatever happens to me, it weakens the kingdom. The alliance pacts will see instability. The Eastern territories will start calculating whether they want to renegotiate their terms. Yes, Seraphine said. He turned from the window. You understand that. I've understood the alliance architecture of this kingdom for 6 years. I've kept 3 of your most volatile pact relationships from collapsing. I know exactly what open session will do. Then you know why you can't. I know, she said, why you're hoping I'll weigh the kingdom against what you did and decide the kingdom matters more. A beat. Does it? He said. It was the most honest question he'd asked her in years. She could see it cost him something to ask it. Not pride. He'd spent that somewhere in the last 12 hours. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for and had stopped looking for. The kingdom, Seraphine said carefully, doesn't have to fall. What falls is you. There's a difference. He looked at her. She looked back. "The child," he said very quietly. "You don't know." "I know," she said. "I have always known something happened that wasn't natural. I just couldn't prove it. Now I can." The silence between them was the longest one they'd had in 7 years. Darius moved first. He crossed back to the door, put his hand on the latch, and stood there for a moment with his back to her. "I'll offer you terms," he said. "The title: a formal annulment, generous settlement, Northern Territory House. You take the midwife back across the border and you don't appear at open session." "No." "Seraphine, no." He stood at the door, hand on the latch, not turning around, and she watched his shoulders settle into a different configuration. Not the too high tension of last night, but something lower, something that in another man she might have called resignation, and in Darius she recognized as the shift into a different mode. The mode where options had run out and what was left was the application of force without any more pretense of negotiation. He opened the door. He looked back at her once, and what was on his face was not anger and not grief, and not the pleading she had never expected from him and would not have believed. It was the specific look of a man who has decided to stop leaving exits open. "I'll be placing additional security on this wing," he said, "for your protection." The door closed, the bolt shifted. She stood in the center of the room, and she heard it, what he hadn't said and didn't need to say. She heard it in the specific quality of silence that a locked door makes when the person who locked it has no intention of opening it again on your terms. Additional security. The kind that wasn't for her protection. 3 days to open session. She pressed her fingers to the bond mark. It burned, not the warning burn anymore, not the heat she'd felt in the vestibule. Something deeper, something that felt like the mark itself was asking her a question. She already knew the answer. She crossed to the desk. Beneath the supply route correspondence, under the second layer of documents, was a single folded page she'd written 3 weeks ago and had not decided until this moment to use. She picked it up, unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting at the top, transcribed from memory. The preparation sequence for the lunar spirit ritual. The steps, in the old language, that her mother had made her memorize twice before explaining what they were for. She stood at the desk with the page in her hands, and through the window she could hear, distantly, the sounds of the training yard below. The impact of practice weapons. The short, sharp calls of instruction. Normal morning sounds. She looked at the page. She had 2 days to find a way out of a locked room, get a midwife through a palace that was about to become hostile territory, and stand in front of the full court before Darius found a way to make the session disappear. She had the young guard on the door who'd eased his grip. She had Mira and the servants' passage. She had Garrett and Solon somewhere in the Northern Territory with a woman who was willing to talk. And she had the thing her mother had left her, the thing she'd carried for 7 years waiting for the moment her mother had described, when the bond itself becomes the wound. She folded the page, put it in the inner pocket of her robe, flat against her ribs. That night, while the palace settled into its second uneasy sleep in 2 days, someone slid a folded note under the servants' passage door. One line in Fenwick's cramped handwriting. "She is here. East Gatehouse." They know she's here. Her breath caught. The midwife had arrived early, and Darius's people already knew. She read the note twice, not because she needed to. One line, Fenwick's handwriting, the meaning was not ambiguous. She read it twice because her mind required 2 passes to absorb both facts simultaneously. The midwife was here, and the midwife had been found. She folded the note and held it flat against her palm and stood very still in the dark of the sitting room, listening. The palace at this hour had its own particular quiet, not silence, but the reduced register of a building that had slowed without stopping. She could hear the guards outside her door. 2 of them, the night rotation, their footfalls settling into the irregular pattern of men trying to stay alert past the point where alertness came naturally. She could hear the distant sound of the East Wing's clock marking the 3rd hour. She could hear her own breathing. She moved to the servants' passage door, listened at it for 30 seconds. Nothing. She opened it. The laundry corridor was empty. She went left toward the back stairwell that connected the East Wing to the ground level, the one used by kitchen staff before dawn. She went in the dark because she knew the distances. 14 steps to the first turn, 9 to the stair, 22 stairs down, The bottom step had a slight give on the left side and would creak if she landed on it wrong. She landed on it right. The east gatehouse was across the inner courtyard, which was not empty. 2 guards on the gate, 1 at the armory door, the torch line along the wall burning at the low, overnight setting. She didn't cross the courtyard. She went through the groundskeeper's passage that ran along the south wall behind the stable line, which connected to the gatehouse's rear entrance by way of a lumber storage room that nobody checked at night because there was nothing in it worth stealing. She had mapped this route 8 months ago, had walked it twice in daylight with a laundry basket as cover, had never thought she would need it for something like this. The lumber room was cold and smelled of resin and old wood, and she stood inside it in the dark and listened through the inner gatehouse wall for about 20 seconds before she identified the voices. 3 of them. 2 she didn't know. 1 was Fenwick. She opened the interior door. But the midwife's name was Hessa. She was older than Seraphine had expected, somewhere past 60, small, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from exhaustion, so deep it had calcified into posture. She sat on a supply crate with both hands in her lap and looked up when Seraphine entered with eyes that had been doing a very specific kind of waiting. The 2 men with Fenwick were not guards. One was a pack liaison she recognized from the Northern Territories, Solon, she understood, the other half of Garrett's pair. The other was a young man she didn't know whose presence she filed and didn't address. Fenwick looked like he hadn't slept at all. He looked specifically like a man who had spent the night understanding exactly how badly he'd miscalculated something. "They came to the east gate 2 hours ago," he said, before she could speak. "Solon's contact at the gate? I thought he was clean. He's been reporting to the king's household for at least a month." Seraphine absorbed this. "Which means they know she's here." "Yes." "How long before they move?" "I don't know. An hour, less." He pressed 2 fingers between his eyes. "My lady, I should have been more careful about the— Not now." She crossed to where Hessa sat and crouched in front of her so their faces were level. "You're the woman from the village, the one Solon brought." Hessa looked at her with those exhausted eyes and said, "I know who you are. I know who you are too. I need to hear it from you directly. Everything. Quickly." The midwife breathed in, breathed out. Then she told it. She told it the way someone tells a thing they've been keeping for 3 years. Not rushing, not performing, just moving through the facts with the flat precision of a person who has rehearsed the account so many times in their own head that emotion has been worn away, and what's left is just the shape of what happened. She told it all. The night, the preparation, the substance she had been given and told was a standard tonic for pain, the way she had known what it was only when she measured the dose and the dose was wrong. Too large, the specific kind of wrong that a trained midwife recognized because she had spent 30 years knowing what correct doses looked like. She told who had handed her the bottle. She told the name, not Evelyn's. Evelyn hadn't been there that night. She was too careful for that. Too careful for almost everything, which was why it had taken Seraphine this long to build anything she could stand behind. The name Hessa gave was a household steward, a man named Davin, who had served the king's personal household for 12 years, and who had, Seraphine happened to know, retired to the Eastern Territories 3 months after her miscarriage, with a stipend that was significantly more generous than his rank warranted. She had the name in the correspondence. Not Davin directly, but a reference, an expense line, coded, that she had spent 2 weeks running down until she found the payment record. 2 separate threads. Same destination. "You'll say this before the council," Seraphine said. "That's why I came." Hessa met her eyes. "I've been 3 years trying to sleep. I don't sleep well." Seraphine stood. She turned to Fenwick. "The session is tomorrow morning," she said. "My lady, if the king's people know she's here, then we need to get her into the council chamber before they can move her." She looked at Solon. "Can you move her tonight?" "Not the gatehouse. The council building itself has holding rooms on the lower level used for witness sequestration. If she's in there by dawn, the council building is locked at night," Fenwick said. "Councillor Marin has a key." Silence. "You'd be asking Marin to— I know what I'd be asking her." Seraphine kept her eyes on Fenwick. "You said the session stays on the calendar. Does it stay if Marin decides it does?" A long pause, the kind that meant yes and was reluctant about it. "Go to her now," Seraphine said. Wake her. Tell her what you've told me." He left. She turned back to the room, and that was when the door behind her, not the lumber room door, the outer gatehouse door, the one that opened onto the east courtyard, moved, not opened. Moved, the slight shift of weight against it from the other side that meant someone was about to. Solon was already in motion. The young man she didn't know had his back to the wall. Hessa sat exactly where she'd been sitting, hands still in her lap, as if she had expected this. Seraphine stepped directly in front of her. The door opened. It was not the king's guard. It was not the household unit. It was Garrett. But Garrett's face was wrong. She had last seen that face 8 hours ago in the vestibule, tight with urgency and what she'd read as loyalty. Now what was on it was a different configuration entirely. The jaw, the way his eyes moved across the room and settled not on her but on Hessa, the very slight compression of his mouth that came before a man said something he'd prepared in advance. He looked at Seraphine. "Step away from her," he said. Seraphine did not move. "Garrett," Solon said, with the voice of a man who is not quite surprised and is trying to decide how much of his shock to show, "What have you done?" "What I was paid to do," Garrett said. He didn't say it with shame, and he didn't say it with defiance. He said it with the flat factual effect of a man who has already made his peace with the decision and is now just executing it. "Both of you, move away from the woman." Behind him, through the open door, Seraphine could see the courtyard, could see the two additional figures waiting in the torchlight. Armed, not household unit, private guard, the king's personal detail, the ones whose loyalty ran to Darius specifically. She had misread him. She had looked at Garrett in the vestibule. The urgency, the rough-traveled dust on his clothes, the way his voice caught when he told her about the midwife. And she had read loyalty. She had read a man who had come to her at personal risk because the truth mattered to him. What she'd actually read was a performance calibrated precisely for her, for what she needed to believe. He had come with exactly the information she was looking for, at exactly the moment she was most ready to receive it, because someone who knew her well enough had briefed him on what would land. 7 years of watching this palace operate, and she had still walked straight into it. The understanding moved through her body like cold water, fast and total. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was very steady. "Did you know about the child?" Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. A flicker at the eyes, the jaw, the specific micro-compression of a man who has been asked a question that his prepared answers don't cover. "Step away from the woman," he said again. "Did you know?" "That's not... Did you know what they put in the bottle?" The flicker again, more visible this time. She was watching him the way she had watched Darius for 7 years, without hope, without the filter of what she wanted to see. And what she saw was a man whose certainty about his transaction had just encountered something it hadn't priced in. "I need you to move," he said. "No," Seraphine said. In the 3 seconds that followed, she ran the inventory. 2 armed men in the courtyard, Garrett between her and the door, Solon to her right with nothing visible in his hands. The unknown young man at the wall, Hessa behind her, and the lumber room door at her back still closed. What she had: a lumber room with a route back to the palace, a servant's passage, and a bond mark burning at her throat with a heat she had been feeling build for 48 hours. What she didn't have: time. "Take her," Garrett said. He was talking to the men in the courtyard. They came through the door. What happened next was fast and ugly and without ceremony. Solon moved first, toward the closer of the 2 men, with the specific efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew the fastest way to stop a larger opponent from completing a crossing motion. He stopped him, barely. The second man came past him while Solon was occupied and reached for Hessa. Seraphine moved, not the way she'd moved in the throne room, not the clean, precise wrist catch of a woman acting from a still center. This was different. She drove her shoulder into the man's midsection from the left, felt the impact jar up through her arm and into the joint, heard his breath leave him in a grunt, and they hit the crate behind Hessa and went down together onto the stone floor. He was twice her size, and he recovered faster than she did. She felt his hand close on her upper arm and haul her upright, and she let it, because being upright meant she was on her feet, and she drove the heel of her free hand into his jaw with enough force to snap his head back. He let go. "Hessa," she said, flat and hard. "The door behind me. Go." The midwife moved. Seraphine heard the lumber room door, heard Hessa's footsteps, heard Solon somewhere behind her, making sounds that suggested his situation was going badly. Garrett caught her. He was faster than the armored guard, less encumbered, and he'd been waiting for her to be separated from Hessa, which she had been. His arm went across her shoulders from behind, pinning her arms, and he hauled her back against him with the force of a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds and had done this before. "Stop," he said in her ear. She stopped, not because she had no options, because she needed 10 seconds to understand her options. The armored guard she had driven into the crate was on his feet. Solon was on the floor. The young man at the wall was gone. She didn't know when he'd left or where. The lumber room door was closed with Hessa presumably on the other side of it. Garrett's arm across her chest, his breathing in her ear, elevated, not quite controlled. "You can't get her out of the building," he said. "There are 3 more in the stable passage." She had used the stable passage to get here. "The king wants the woman back at the border," Garrett said. "That's all. Nobody gets hurt." "I was there," Seraphine said. 3 years ago. I was the one it was done to." She kept her voice flat and level, because the flatness was the only thing she had right now, and she was not going to give it up. "You're standing here asking me to let them take the only witness and call it nobody getting hurt. My lady." His arm tightened fractionally. "I'm sorry about the child. I am. But this is bigger than—" "Don't. The kingdom. Don't." The bond mark flared. Not the building heat she'd been feeling. This was sudden, specific, a deep burning pulse that moved from the mark down through her chest and into her hands, and her hands, pinned against Garrett's arm, lit up with a silver light that was there and gone in under a second. Garrett felt it. She felt him feel it. The slight flinch, the involuntary loosening of grip. Just enough. She drove her elbow back into his ribs, twisted free, and put 6 feet between herself and everyone else in the room. The armored guard moved toward her. The bond mark flared again. Longer this time, the silver at her hands visible for 2 full seconds, and the air in the room shifted the way air shifted before a storm, that specific electrical heaviness that made the skin react before the mind understood why. The guard stopped, not because she'd done anything to him, because some things ran deeper than orders. Garrett was looking at her hands with an expression that had discarded all its prepared components and was operating on something more fundamental. "What are you?" he said. She didn't answer. She backed to the lumber room door and opened it without turning her back on the room. The passage was empty. Hessa was gone. Not captured, she would have heard it, just gone deeper into the passage the way Seraphine had told her to go. She stood in the doorway and looked at Garrett. "The session is tomorrow morning," she said. "Whatever you do in the next 12 hours, there are council members who've seen the letters and heard what I said in this hall. You can move the midwife back to the border. You can lock my door again. You can do everything the king is paying you to do." She held his eyes. "None of it closes the door now. You opened it when you came to me with the truth inside a lie. You gave me her name. You gave me the location. Whatever else you were paid for, you gave me that." His face moved through something she didn't have time to interpret. She went through the door. She didn't find Hessa in the lumber passage. She found her at the bottom of the back stairwell, sitting on the second step with her hands still in her lap, waiting with the same exhausted patience she'd had in the gatehouse. Someone, the young man who'd been at the wall, she understood now, who was not unknown but simply unannounced, was sitting beside her. Seraphine stopped. The young man looked up. He was perhaps 20, with the build of a runner and the eyes of someone older, and he said, "Counselor Marin sent me. She has the key." Seraphine stared at him for 2 seconds. "She knew," she said. "She suspected. For a while." He stood. "She's been waiting for you to move. She didn't know when." Seraphine looked at Hessa. Hessa looked back with those eyes that had been waiting for 3 years to do something other than run. "Can you walk?" Seraphine asked. "I've been walking for 3 days," Hessa said. "I can walk a little more." They went up the stairs. The council chamber's lower-level holding room was small and cold, and had a door that locked from the inside with a bolt thick enough that it would take a battering ram to move. Seraphine had Hessa inside it by the time the 4th hour bell rang across the palace. The young man, his name was Corvin, He was Marin's nephew. He had been the one who slipped the note under the servants' passage door, stood outside the holding room door, and did not look like a person who was afraid, which she found steadying. Marin herself arrived 15 minutes later. She was dressed for the day already, which meant she had not been to bed, which meant she had been expecting something like this and had decided how to handle it before it arrived. She looked at Seraphine, took in the split along her palm from the crate. She hadn't noticed it until the cold air hit it, and the general condition of someone who had spent the last hour in a lumber room and a gatehouse altercation. "Garrett?" Marin said. "Yes." "I thought so." She said it with the tired precision of a woman confirming a suspicion she'd hoped was wrong. "He's been the King's inside contact on the Northern Patrol for at least 8 months. I didn't have proof until tonight." "I didn't have it until 10 minutes ago." A pause. "The session is in 4 hours," Marin said. "Can you hold it?" "I can hold it if you can stand in it." She looked at Seraphine steadily. "Can you stand in it?" Seraphine thought of the lumber room, the crate, the silver light at her hands that she'd felt and not controlled, and which was still humming somewhere in her blood with the specific quality of something that had been restrained for a very long time and was running out of patience. She thought of Hessa sitting on the step. She thought of the word Darius had used about the kingdom like it was an argument that should settle the question. "Yes," she said. Marin nodded. "Then go clean that hand. You have 3 hours." Seraphine went. She climbed back up through the servant passages to the Queen's wing, through the laundry corridor, through the passage door, and into her own rooms where the bolt on the outer door was still engaged and the 2 guards outside it were still walking their irregular night pattern, believing she was inside. She was inside. She sat at the desk and looked at the page still folded against her ribs and felt the bond mark burning with a heat that was no longer a warning and no longer a question. It was an answer. The session would start in 3 hours, and Darius would move to stop it, and she had a midwife in a locked room and a counselor with a key and a silver light in her hands she had not summoned and could not quite explain. And somewhere in the palace, Garrett was deciding whether the man who'd paid him was still the safer bet. She unfolded the page. She began to read. She read the page until she had it in her hands the way she had it in her memory. Not line by line anymore, but whole. The way a piece of music becomes whole after enough repetitions that you stop hearing the notes separately. Then she burned it, not carelessly. She held it over the candle on the desk and watched the old language curl and blacken from the bottom up, and she held it until the last corner went and the ash drifted down onto the stone, and then she pressed her palm flat on the ash and held it there. Her mother had said, "You will know when." She knew. The 3 hours ran faster than they should have. She cleaned her hand with the water basin. The split along the palm was shallow. It would scar if she left it untended, but it wouldn't open again if she wrapped it, and she wrapped it with a strip torn from the hem of an old underskirt, tight and flat, and flexed her fingers twice to test the hold. Fine. She changed out of the ceremonial robe. Under it, she wore the plain wool dress she'd had made 18 months ago, specifically because it had no ornament, no train, nothing that could be grabbed. She had thought at the time that she was being overcautious. She was not being overcautious. At the 2-hour mark, she heard movement outside the outer door. A change in the guard rotation, new voices, the particular cadence of a relief posting. She listened, and what she heard was 3 voices, not 2. 3 guards now. Darius had added 1 in the night. She noted it, added it to the inventory, and went back to what she was doing. At the 1-hour mark, she heard something else. A sound in the servants' passage. Not Mira. Mira moved with a specific pattern she knew as well as her own. This was heavier, less certain. She stood at the passage door and listened for 40 seconds before she identified it as Corvin, Marin's nephew, moving up from the lower level. She opened the door. He was out of breath. He pressed himself into the passage and spoke low and fast. "The King's household unit went to the East Gatehouse 20 minutes ago. When they found the room empty..." He stopped, gathered himself. "They have Solon. They took him from the outer courtyard." She processed this. "Hessa is still in the holding room?" "Yes. Marin has her. The chamber is locked." "Who else knows the council session is happening?" "Every representative who was at the ceremony. The ambassadors. The Northern Pact delegation." He met her eyes. "Half of them have been awake since the ceremony. They're in the guest quarters talking. My lady, the ones from the Eastern Territories. They came to Marin's door an hour ago asking what she needed from them. She looked at him steadily. What did she say? She said she needed them in their seats in 1 hour. Seraphine exhaled slowly. Something she had not allowed herself to count on had just become real. The witnesses. Not just the council, not just the Silver Fang members who operated inside Darius's structure of leverage and debt and decades-long accommodation, but the outside representatives, the ones who owed him nothing, and whose presence in that chamber he could not legally remove without creating the precise kind of incident that would accelerate the very collapse he was trying to prevent. He had trapped himself with his own ceremony. Go back to Marin, she said. Tell her I'll be at the council chamber door in 40 minutes. Tell her to have the room full before I get there. He went. She turned back to the outer door. 3 guards between her and the corridor. She sat on the edge of the desk and looked at her wrapped hand and felt the bond mark burning with that deep, steady heat that had been building since the vestibule 2 days ago and was now something she could feel in her back teeth, in the joints of her fingers, in the specific place behind her eyes where decisions lived. She thought about the 3 guards. She thought about the young man from the gate rotation who had eased his grip. She crossed to the outer door and knocked on it from the inside. Once, flat-palmed. A pause. Then one of the guards, My lady? I need water. The basin is empty. Another pause. I'll send for... The kitchen is 2 floors down. There's a water pitcher in the alcove at the end of this corridor. It takes 30 seconds. She kept her voice even, practical. The voice of a woman managing a domestic inconvenience. I would ask that someone fetch it. Silence. The specific quality of 3 men in a corridor deciding which of them goes. Footsteps. 1 set, moving away. 2 guards left. She waited 40 seconds. Then she knocked again. I also need my attendant. She'll need to escort me to the... She paused, let a beat of what she intended to sound like embarrassment land. The bathing room is on this level. I haven't been able to leave for 2 days. I assume that's not what the king intended. The voice that answered was the gate rotation guard. She recognized it now. My lady, I can't... I'm not asking you to escort me. I'm asking you to send for Mira. She can take me. You'd have nothing to answer for. You'd still be at this door. A long silence. She had put him somewhere specific. A man who understood on some level what the last 2 days had been, asked to do something that was technically within the bounds of his post, not letting her leave, just letting her attendant come. The bolt moved, not the outer bolt, the inner latch. The door opened 3 inches. The guard's face in the gap was young and carefully neutral. My attendant, Seraphine said. That's all. He nodded, pulled his door to. She heard him speak quietly to someone in the corridor, the second guard, and then footsteps going in the direction of the servant's stairwell. Both of them. She gave it 20 seconds. Then she opened the door from inside with the handle she had always had access to, stepped into the corridor and walked. She didn't run. Running was for people who had already been seen. She walked at the pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and the right to be there, and she took the south corridor to the internal stairwell and went down 2 floors to the administrative wing and out through the council building's connecting passage without encountering anyone who stopped her. The council chamber smelled of old paper and candle wax, and the particular staleness of a room that had been closed and then rapidly filled with people who'd been awake too long. Every seat at the long table was occupied. The representatives from the Eastern Territories sat in a tight cluster at the far end with the body language of men who had made a decision and were sitting in it. The Northern Pack delegates were along the right wall. Fenwick sat at the council's end of the table with both hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the door. Marin stood at the head of the room. When Seraphine entered, the room went quiet, in the way a room went quiet when the thing it had been waiting for finally arrived. Marin looked at her hand, looked at her face. Hessa is at the witness table, Marin said. Ready? Yes. She crossed to the secondary chair beside the witness table where Hessa sat in the same posture she'd held in the gatehouse, hands in her lap, exhausted, ready. Then the far doors opened. Darius came in with 4 of the household guard and Counselor Aldrich at his shoulder, and the face of a man who had been told what was happening in this room and had decided that the response was to arrive and dominate it before it could proceed without him. He wore the rank collar and the thorn sigil. He had slept, maybe. His eyes said he hadn't. His eyes found Seraphine, moved to Hessa, back to Seraphine. This session, he said, addressing Marin without looking at her, has not been authorized. The open session is a standing authorization, Marin said. Calendar item. You were informed of the date at last month's. The agenda has not been approved. The standing session doesn't require agenda pre-approval. That's been the procedural basis since I'm dissolving this session. He moved to the head of the table, to the Alpha's chair, and he put his hands on the back of it and looked across the room with the weight of a man who had held this room's compliance for 6 years and intended to hold it now. Everyone will return to their quarters. The council will convene with proper process in 1 week, at which time the Luna's claims will be addressed through Sire. The voice came from the Eastern Territory delegation. The man who spoke was older, thicker through the shoulders, with the broad, flat accent of the Far Eastern Pax. His name was Aldous Grain, and he was the senior representative of a coalition that controlled 3 of the most strategically critical border territories in the Alliance. We came here for the Blood Moon ceremony and witnessed what we witnessed. We've been in this building since the 2nd hour of the morning because we can't in good conscience leave without understanding what was alleged. Representative Grain, we're not asking for permission, Grain said. We're telling you we're staying. The room held its breath. Seraphine watched Darius's hands on the chair back, watched the tendons across the backs of his knuckles, which she knew, which she had been watching for 7 years, and she read in them the exact calculation running behind his face. 4 guards, 20-odd representatives and council members, visiting delegation from territories he could not afford to alienate, and a woman he'd had locked in a room for 2 days sitting at a witness table with someone he'd spent 3 years and significant money making sure would never appear in this kingdom again. He pulled the chair out and sat in it. Not a retreat. She watched him reframe it in real time, watched him decide that the sitting was a choice, and the choice was strategic, and she did not look away from his face, because looking away was not something she was going to do. Proceed, he said. Marin nodded. Hessa spoke for 12 minutes. She spoke without theater and without hesitation, and she made eye contact with no one in particular, just the middle distance above the table, the way a person spoke when they'd held something for long enough that telling it had become a necessity rather than a performance. She told them the night, the bottle, the dose, the name Davin, the sum she'd been paid afterward to leave and stay gone, the letter she'd received 2 years later, after she'd talked to the wrong person in the wrong village, reminding her of how much she'd been given and what she'd agreed to in exchange. The room was silent for 30 seconds after she stopped. Then one of the Northern Pack delegates said, very quietly, "The steward Davin, where is he now?" "Eastern Territories," Seraphine said. "He took a retirement stipend 3 months after the miscarriage. The payment record is in the archive, cross-referenced to an expense line in the household accounts from that period. Cabinet 9, 3rd floor." She reached into the inner pocket of her dress and put 2 folded sheets on the table. The transcriptions she'd made from memory. Not the originals, which were still in Cabinet 16, but accurate enough to direct a search. "The Crane correspondence is in Cabinet 60, she said. "Same floor. The dates establish contact between the Crown and Lady Evelyn's family 11 weeks before the miscarriage." She looked at Marin. "I'd ask the council to formally request both cabinet contents be produced and placed in secure custody before any adjournment." Marin was already writing. Darius had not moved or spoken since Hessa began. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his face doing something very controlled. And Seraphine had spent long enough studying this man to know what the control was containing. Not rage, not panic, but the specific cold machinery of someone running the last available options and finding them fewer than they'd been an hour ago. He found one. "The woman's testimony," he said, and his voice was completely even, "is the account of someone who fled the kingdom under undisclosed circumstances 3 years ago and who has been located and transported here by persons acting at my queen's direction. The provenance is compromised. The testimony is motivated. It proves nothing except that my queen has been conducting an unauthorized private investigation using council resources she had no clearance to. The key to Cabinet 16, Seraphine said, was given to me by a council member who believed the contents were material to the kingdom's governance." She paused. "Which they are." "A council member who exceeded their authority." a council member who understood their responsibility. Darius looked at her across the length of the table. The room understood it was watching something that had been building for longer than tonight, and was now occurring in real time without the usual filters of private walls. "You want to do this here," he said. "I've been doing it here since the Blood Moon ceremony," she said. "You're the one who chose this room and this table." His jaw worked. "Everything you've built," he said, low, almost just for her despite the room, "everything this kingdom has, you're burning it for this." "I'm not burning anything," she said. "You did that 3 years ago in a room you thought I'd never find my way back to." His right hand, flat on the table, closed. "Remove her," he said to the guards. Nobody moved. The 4 guards stood at their posts and looked at the room. At the 20-odd representatives, at Marin still writing, at Grain of the Eastern Territories with his broad arms folded and his face containing absolutely nothing that resembled compliance. And they did not move. One of them, the nearest, looked at Darius with an expression that Seraphine had never seen on a palace guard's face, directed at the Alpha King. Uncertainty. Darius stood. He came around the table, not toward the guards, toward Seraphine, and this was the part she had been waiting for since the vestibule. The moment when the options ran to the last one, and the last one was force, direct, and personal. The part where an Alpha's training reduced everything to the most basic available answer. She stood. She put herself between him and the table, and she did not step back. "Don't," she said. He was close enough that she could hear his breathing, elevated, not quite controlled, the breath of a man whose body had already decided something that his mind was still processing. "You don't have the standing to," he started. "I have every standing," she said. "I am still your bonded Luna until one of us ends it, and you will not put your hands on me in front of witnesses who are going to determine the future governance of this kingdom." He stopped. Not because she'd convinced him, because she'd said the thing that landed on the calculation. Witnesses, governance, the specific combination of words that reached the part of him that had always been a ruler first. She pressed it. "Step back," she said. "Sit down. Let the council do its work. Or do what you're about to do, and let every representative in this room see exactly what this throne looks like when it's losing." His eyes. She had never seen them like this. Not the flat dark of controlled authority, not the tactical blankness. Something had come up through them from wherever he kept what he actually felt, and what it was the look of a man who has run the inventory and found it empty. He was one step away from her. The bond mark erupted. Not a flare, not the building heat, erupted, a white-hot pulse that drove from the mark through her entire body so fast and so complete that it moved her before she understood she was moving, and her hands came up between them, blazing with the silver light she'd felt in the gatehouse, and not controlled, and which she was still not controlling. It was moving through her the way current moved through water. It was the power her mother had described, and it was fully awake, and it was looking at the bond between her and this man, and it was asking her the question one final time. She had already answered it, but she did not complete it. Not yet. Not here. Not like this. With his face this close, and the room watching, and the whole weight of 7 years still unspoken between them. She needed him to understand what he was losing before she took it. She needed him to see it clearly. The silver light pulsed between her hands, visible to every person in the room, and the air around them smelled of lightning and old stone, and the specific ozone sharpness that the old texts called lunar fire. Darius looked at her hands. He looked at her face. And for the first time in 7 years, she saw in his face what she had spent years looking for, and stopped looking for, and thought she'd made her peace with never finding. He saw her. Not the reliable queen, not the quiet administrator. Not the woman in the background keeping his kingdom from fracturing while he filled his court with a different kind of woman. He saw her, what she was, what had been standing next to him for 7 years, what he had spent 7 years not being afraid of and was afraid of now. "Seraphine," he said. Just her name, no title, no command inside it. The silver light in her hands answered before she did. It ran up her arms and across her collarbone, and the bond mark burned with a heat she felt in her spine, and her vision went bright at the edges with it, and the power that had lived in her bloodline since before this kingdom had walls looked at the man in front of her and prepared to do the one thing her mother had warned her about, and the one thing she had spent 7 years hoping she would never need to do. Every witness in the chamber stood still, every torch in the room guttered, and Seraphine looked at Darius Thorne, at the man who had humiliated her before his court, who had arranged for something to be put in a bottle in a room she remembered in the specific body way of things that never fully left you. And she pulled the power back by one breath. One breath. Because she had decided she would not do this here, not in this chamber, not with this audience. She would do it in the throne room, in front of everyone who had watched her humiliated. She would make him kneel before she made it permanent, and it would not be a small thing, and it would not be private, and every pack in this alliance would know what it looked like when Aluna reached the end of what she was willing to endure. The silver light receded into her skin. The room remained absolutely still. Darius's face, in the aftermath of the light, was the face of a man who had just understood the exact distance of the cliff he was standing on. Seraphine took one step back. "Counsel," she said, and her voice came out even and cold and completely her own. "I request a formal session before the full court. Tomorrow morning. Throne room." She did not look away from Darius. "I have one thing left to do, and it requires the room where it started." Marin's voice behind her. "The session is granted." And Darius stood in the council chamber with the 4 guards who hadn't moved at his order, and the 20 representatives who had watched his bond mark's other half light up the air between them like a warning fired across open water. And he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say that would change what was coming. Tomorrow. The throne room. The place where she had been told to kneel. She did not sleep. She sat in the council building's small anteroom, with her back against the stone wall and her wrapped hand in her lap, and she let the hours move through her without trying to use them. There was nothing left to prepare. Every piece was placed. Every witness was where they needed to be. The archive keys were in Marin's possession. Tessa was in the locked holding room with Corvin outside the door and would be escorted to the throne room in the morning by the Eastern Territory representatives themselves. Grain had offered it, quietly, after the chamber cleared, with the matter-of-fact gravity of a man who had looked at the situation and decided which side of history he intended to be on. What was left was not preparation. What was left was the thing you carried alone into the last room. She thought about her mother, not the lessons. Those were in her hands and her blood and her bone now, past the point of being lessons. She thought about her mother as a person, a small, precise woman who had spent 40 years navigating a world that rewarded a specific kind of loudness she had never possessed and had never learned to fake. A woman who had been underestimated with such consistency that she had eventually learned to use it the way a blade used an edge. Let them lean in, let them assume, and then show them what they'd been leaning against. She had told Seraphine the power would come when the bond became the wound. She hadn't said what came after. Seraphine understood now that was because what came after couldn't be told. It could only be walked through, at actual speed, with actual weight, in the actual body you had. Her mother had trusted her to be able to bear it when she got there. She pressed her back against the stone and felt the bond mark and let it burn and did not ask it to stop. By the time the gray light came through the anteroom's narrow window, she was ready. The throne room filled the way it had filled for the blood moon ceremony, slowly at first, then all at once, as word moved through the palace the way water moved through cracked stone, finding every path, filling every space, impossible to stop once it had started. They came in formal dress, most of them, because whatever this was, it had the weight of an occasion, and people dressed for weight when they felt it coming. The council members took the left side. The pack representatives and ambassadors stood at the back. Grain at the center of the Eastern delegation, arms folded, face holding the same settled quality it had held in the council chamber. The northern packs were along the right wall. Palace staff had gathered at the upper gallery, which was not protocol, but nobody moved them. Tessa sat in a chair that had been placed to the right of the ceremonial dais. She sat in it with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and she looked like a woman who had made a very long trip and had finally arrived at the place the trip was for. Darius stood at the front. He had not sat in the throne. She noted that when she entered, the throne empty behind him standing in front of it rather than in it, which was either a tactical decision about optics or something he had not fully decided consciously. He wore no rank collar, just the dark wool of his ordinary clothes, the same he'd been in when he came to her chambers. He looked like a man who had spent a night understanding something he'd been refusing to understand for years. He looked, for the first time in 7 years, like his actual age. The court went quiet when Seraphine walked through the main doors. She wore the plain wool dress. No ceremony, no silver embroidery. She had unbound her hair because the pins gave her a headache and she was done managing discomfort for the sake of appearances. She walked the same path she'd walked 2 days ago, the torchlight line from the doors to the dais, and she did not look at Evelyn's chair, which was empty, which she had expected. She stopped at the center of the room, the same place she'd stopped before. "This isn't a trial," she said, and her voice carried to the back walls without effort. "I want to say that first so everyone present understands the function of this session. The council's formal proceedings will determine accountability. What happens in this room today is something different. It's a record. It's a witness. It's what gets carried out of here in the memory of every person standing in it." She looked at the council section. "Councillor Marin has the archive contents in custody. The physical record will be available for formal review." She looked at the Eastern delegation. "Representative Grain and his colleagues have offered to act as independent witnesses to the proceedings, which the council has accepted." Then she looked at Darius. "I'm going to say what happened," she said. "All of it. And then I'm going to do what I came to do. And then this is over." He held her gaze. His jaw was set. His hands at his sides were open. Not closed. Not the tell she'd read 100 times. Open. She noted it and didn't know yet what to do with it. She turned to the room. She spoke for 20 minutes. She told it the way Hesse had told it, without theater, without the rising architecture of a speech designed to produce a particular emotional response. Just the sequence of facts, placed one after another in their actual order, letting the order carry what it carried without her pushing it. The letters. The dates. The name Davin and the payment and the bottle. The night itself, her own account now, the things she had known and not been able to prove. The physical experience of what a woman knew in her body had not been accidental even when she had no evidence yet that it wasn't. She told it plain and she told it complete, and she did not look at Darius while she told it. When she finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of 200 people who had heard something they already suspected confirmed into clarity, and who were now sitting inside the specific gravity of having it be real and said and witnessed. Evelyn was not in the room. She had left the palace. Seraphine had been told by Corvin at dawn, sometime in the previous night. Taken a horse from the east stable. Gone without her attendants, without the household gold, without anything she couldn't carry herself. The speed of it suggested she had been prepared to go, that she had watched the council session develop and made a calculation and executed it before the outcome could close the exits. She would be found. That was not Seraphine's work to do. That was the consequence moving at its own pace toward its own destination. What was here, in this room, was hers. She turned back to Darius. "I'm not going to ask you to answer to me," she said. "The council will determine what you answer to and when." She paused. "What I'm going to do now is end the bond, the lunar spirit rite. It's irreversible and it will be witnessed. A sound from the court, not a protest, just the adjustment of 200 people receiving a piece of information their bodies had to process." Darius said nothing. She looked at him. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," he said. "Do you want to say anything before—" "Yes." She waited. He looked at her for a long moment with those 7 years older eyes, and she watched him find the words the way she'd watched him find things that didn't come easily. With effort, without grace. The particular ungainliness of a dominant man operating outside his native register. "I knew about the letters," he said. "I didn't know about Davin." He held her eyes. "I want you to believe that. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I know the difference between those two things. I'm just telling you the actual distinction." She looked at him. In 7 years, she had learned to read the specific textures of his dishonesty, the places where the story he was telling didn't quite fit the shape of the truth underneath it. She read him now, the jaw, the eyes, the open hands. And what she found was not the texture of a lie. She didn't know what to do with that. She had spent the last 3 days building toward a specific understanding of who he was and what he had done. And the understanding was not wrong. The letters were real. The payment was real. The outcome was real. And whatever the exact perimeter of his knowledge, it had happened inside the architecture he had built and maintained and benefited from. The distinction he was drawing was real and also insufficient. Both of those things were true at the same time. She had not known, until this moment, how much harder it was to do this when the thing you were ending was not entirely a monster. "I believe you," she said. He absorbed this. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "I know." She breathed in, she breathed out. She lifted her hand to the bond mark at her throat, not covering it, just touching it. The two-finger acknowledgement she'd been making for 3 days. Feeling it. Saying goodbye to it the way you said goodbye to a wound you'd carried long enough that it had become part of the landscape of yourself. She had loved him once. That was true too, and she let it be true, standing in the room where he had told her to kneel. Love wasn't a verdict. It wasn't an excuse. It was a thing that had existed and had been handled badly by both of them, and which had ended not with the bond mark, but years before, in 100 small moments she had not allowed herself to name until now. She named them now. Let them be what they were, and then she let them go. The power came up through her like it had been waiting, not the eruption of the council chamber, not the desperate flare of the gatehouse. Something older and more deliberate, the way a tide came in, steady, complete, unstoppable, not because of force, but because of nature. The silver light moved up her arms and across her collarbone, and the bond mark blazed with a heat she felt in every part of her at once. It did not hurt the way she'd expected. Her mother had said pain. Real pain, the kind that takes you under. What she felt instead was release. The specific physical sensation of a thing that has been held under pressure for a very long time suddenly being allowed to be its actual size. A loosening in the chest, a clearing in the throat. The sensation of breathing in a room where, for years, the air had been slightly thin. The bond mark cracked. The light between her hands pulsed outward. Across the room, Darius made a sound. She had never heard that sound from him before. Low, involuntary, the sound of something being taken from the body rather than given. He didn't go to his knees, or he started to and stopped himself. One knee dropping and then catching, one hand going to the wall beside the throne for support, his head bowing for a moment and then coming up. His neck, above the collar of his ordinary coat, was bare. The bond mark was gone. Not faded, gone. The skin smooth where it had been, the way skin looked when something had been removed completely rather than healed over. The light faded from Seraphine's hands. The room was completely still. She felt the absence of the bond the way she had felt the cold of the vestibule 2 nights ago. Total, immediate, real. A space where something had been. Not an emptiness exactly. More like the specific silence after a sound you'd been hearing for so long you'd stopped registering it, and then it stopped, and the silence had its own texture and weight, and was not nothing. She pressed 2 fingers to her own neck. Her bond mark was gone too. She stood in the throne room of the Silverfang Kingdom, with bare skin where 7 years of her life had been written, and she breathed, and she was more completely herself than she had been since before she understood what it cost to be anything else. What came after was not a single moment, but a sequence of them, each one smaller than the last, each one necessary. The council filed out. The representatives filed out. Grain paused at the door long enough to look back at her with a nod that meant more than courtesy. It meant witness. It meant record. It meant the Eastern Territories had seen this and would not pretend they hadn't. She returned the nod and he left. Hessa was escorted out by Corvin, who had developed over 3 days the protective gravity of a young man who had seen something real and decided which side of it he was on. Hessa paused beside Seraphine on her way to the door and put one dry hand briefly on her arm. Said nothing. Seraphine looked at her and found she had nothing to say either, and found that was all right. The guards cleared the room by Marin's instruction. At the end, it was just the 2 of them. Darius had not moved from the wall beside the throne. He stood there with his hand no longer braced against it, just standing, without the rank collar and the managed posture and the weight of performance, standing the way people stood when they'd run out of things to perform. She should leave. She knew that. The work was done, and the room was cleared, and there was no productive function left in staying. She stayed for 1 minute more. "The kingdom," she said. "The council will stabilize it. Grain and the Eastern Pact Coalition will hold the alliance if the council acts cleanly. Fenwick knows the northern supply channels. Marin is more capable than you've let her be." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "You knew she was capable." Yes. You kept her constrained because capable people are harder to control. A pause. Yes. She looked at him and felt the bare skin of her neck, and felt the absence of the thing that had bound them, and understood something she had not understood until this moment, standing in its aftermath, that the cruelty had not been simple. It had not been the cruelty of a man who felt nothing. It had been the cruelty of a man who felt threatened by the specific quality of the people around him and had spent years managing that threat through diminishment, and who had done it so consistently and so completely that he had eventually diminished himself. Had built a court of people who couldn't challenge him and found himself surrounded by people who couldn't save him either. He had made himself alone. She had not known, until this moment, that she could feel something adjacent to pity for him and still have done what she'd done and know it was right. The council will determine your accountability, she said. I won't influence that. Whatever they decide, I won't advocate for or against. That's more than I deserve. It's not about what you deserve, it's about what I can live with. He absorbed this. Where will you go? He said. North, she said. There are people there who knew my mother. I have things to learn that I should have learned a long time ago. She paused. And then, I don't know yet. I'll find out. She turned toward the door. Seraphine. She stopped, did not turn back. I see it now, he said. What I had. I know there's nothing that does with it. I just want you to know that I see it. She stood with her back to him and her hand near the door, and she felt the truth of what he'd said, not in the way she would have once wanted to feel it, not as vindication or arrival, but as a fact that was real and too late and carried its own specific weight, the weight of understanding coming to a person after the moment when it could have changed anything. Some understandings came too late to be useful. They were still understandings. I know you do, she said. She left. The North Road out of the Silver Fang capital ran through the outer market and the Low District and then up through the Pine Line, where the city thinned and the air changed and you could feel the altitude before you could see it. She had ridden this road once before, years ago, with a delegation. She had looked at the mountains then and thought about her mother and thought, someday. She rode it now in the early afternoon alone, with a pack that held the things she'd chosen to take. Not many, not weighted toward anything that belonged to the Queen's wing, mostly the practical and the personal. The Bondmark's absence was still new enough to notice. She kept almost reaching for it and finding skin. She let herself notice it each time without pulling her hand away. Just felt it, the bare skin, the new topology of herself. Grief was not the right word for it. Grief implied something clean and singular. What she carried was more textured than that. Not just the bond, not just Darius, not just the miscarriage that lived in her body as a permanent fact regardless of what she proved in any council chamber. All of it together, the whole 7-year weight of it, which she was not going to be able to set down all at once, and which she was not going to spend the rest of her life carrying in the shape it had taken inside the marriage. She would carry it differently. That was the work. Not the absence of weight, but the relearning of how to bear it, upright, with her eyes open, in a direction she was choosing. Her mother had carried things too, had carried them and still been the woman who pressed a complicated truth into a daughter's memory and trusted her to know when to use it. That was not a woman who had been undone by what she carried. That was a woman who had learned the difference between a burden and a foundation. The difference between weight that crushed you and weight that made the ground solid under your feet. She was beginning to understand that difference. The pines closed around the road, and the city dropped behind the first ridge, and then it was just the sound of the horse, and the wind in the upper branches, and the specific quality of northern light that was older and colder and less interested in human drama than the light in the capital. She rode for an hour before she stopped, not because she needed to rest, because there was a place where the road bent around a rock outcropping, and the mountains came fully visible for the first time, the whole northern range, running east to west across the horizon, the peaks still carrying snow in the upper elevations, even at this season, white against the deep blue of the afternoon sky. She stopped the horse. She looked at the mountains. She had spent 7 years looking at the ceiling of the Queen's wing, trying to see something worth orienting toward, and it had been in this direction the whole time, waiting with the particular patience of things that do not need to be acknowledged in order to exist. The Bondmark was gone. The silver light was quiet in her blood. Not absent, never absent again. She understood that now. Just settled. Just resting. Just waiting to be what it was when she needed it, which was her mother's gift and her birthright, and the thing that had been growing in the dark of the palace for 7 years the same way she had. She was 31 years old. She had broken an Alpha King's bond in front of his court. She had built a case from the inside of a locked room. She had walked through the door where she'd been told to kneel, and she had not knelt. She did not feel triumphant. She felt wrung out and real, and very, very awake. The specific aliveness of a person who has been through something true, and is on the other side of it, and is beginning to understand that the other side has its own country, its own weather, its own requirements. She would learn the requirements. She had always been good at learning. She pressed her fingers to her bare neck one last time. Not habit, not mourning. A marker. This was real, and I carried it, and I am not that woman anymore in the way I was. And I am not less for having been her. Then she dropped her hand. She looked at the mountains. She rode toward them. Behind her, in the capital, the Silverfang Kingdom would do what kingdoms did in the aftermath of their own reckoning. Fracture, argue, slowly reassemble around whatever truth the council excavated from the archive. Darius would face what he would face. Evelyn would be found or not found. Fenwick would navigate the supply channels, and Marin would do the work she'd been constrained from doing, and Grain would hold the Eastern Coalition, and the kingdom would survive because kingdoms built on real foundations did, even when the people at the top of them fell. She was not the top of it anymore. She was the woman riding north into her own unwritten territory, carrying a power that was finally fully awake, heading toward people who had known her mother and who would know, when they saw her, what bloodline she was walking back toward. The mountains were very old and very patient. They had seen Alpha Kings before. They had seen what came after. She rode into their shadow, and the shadow was cool, and the air was clean, and the road ahead was long and entirely, completely hers.